Hi everyone, and I hope you're having a good time at the moment with the event. It's been fantastic, packed with some really cool content. So I think there are a lot of takeaways out of this event, and of course there will be a lot of going back and seeing and watching the recordings. Before I start, of course, I would like to thank the GoAP organizing committee and of course my company T-Works for the opportunity to present and discuss this return on investment model or validation model applied to enterprise machine translation programs. Of course, I would like to thank all of you, for taking the time to watch and listen to my presentation. So my name is Rodrigo Cristina, and a fun fact about me and my localization career, apart the obvious surname, is that once in Stockholm, I got a parking ticket while having a meeting in my rental car with the localization manager of a notorious global brand. On a more serious note, I am a T-Works customer localization champion. That means that I'm someone that deeply cares about solving my customers' localization problems. So I've been in the localization industry for quite some time, roughly 15 years. And throughout this fantastic journey, I've learned one very important thing. My customers' success and the success of their localization programs is intrinsically connected to my own personal success. So it was embedded with this, I would say, spirit almost of mission of helping my customers finding answers for the ROI problematic that I started looking at how should we measure the return on investment of a machine transition program at the enterprise level. So before we start, let me give you a very short and brief overview of the organization that I work for. So T-Works Group is an exciting new proposition in the market. It's an end-to-end localization services partner, and it was formed in 2018. So as you can see, it's a relatively new value proposition, but it packs a lot of experience. Our localization delivery ecosystem combines our extensive internal team of linguists with state-of-the-art language technology to deliver value. I don't know if you've seen Slater quite recently. We're quite active at the moment, and in the future, it's predicted that that trend will continue in the merger and acquisitions front. Just recently, we have acquired a very well-established, medium-sized French LSP just last week. I think it was published yesterday in Slater. So more to come for sure, because our growth will continue in that particular front as well. So I think, again, in an incredibly fragmented localization industry, everybody claims to be customer-centric. At T-Works, we can back that claim up by delivering what I consider a unique and very differentiated customer experience through our client-dedicated in-house teams model. In fact, the only genuine claim that we have is that we are totally focused and totally obsessed in delivering value to our customers. Because we're talking about machine translation, I think it's incredibly important to understand both T-Works' philosophy and approach to machine translation. Being an LSP in its core, we understand MT technology as a facilitator. So things don't finish at machine translation. So machine translation is basically a facilitator to improve language quality, to decrease time to market, and achieve significant cost savings. So in reality, we take a more holistic vision of machine translation technology. It's not the end, but many times it's the starting point and a component, a very important and key component of the translation ecosystem. it's also important to understand, coming from, and this is pretty much consistent across several activities or several localization activities of TWorks, we are relying a lot in this I would say duplicity of being on one hand completely language technology agnostic, and of course that includes machine translation technology, and on the other hand relying heavily in our in-house, in this case post-editing team, but it's basically our in-house linguistic talent. So as you can see, I'm not going to, this is definitely not by all means a sales pitch at all, but you'll be able to see that a lot of the key characteristics of what it means to be technology agnostic and what it means to deliver language services from an in-house perspective. Now, let's take a deep dive. It's time to take a deep dive in the actual model. I think we can all agree, and this is pretty much an endless discussion in the localization industry. We all agree that measuring return on investment, measuring return on investment in localization activities is many times complex. And of course, it's the starting point for many difficult and frustrating conversations. I think historically, this has been one of the toughest and most spoken and talked tasks that localization stakeholders have had to perform, especially over the last years. I think the relevance of the financial aspect within a localization program has become more and more apparent. So the idea is, how do we convince a localization budget holder, and sometimes not even a localization budget holder, but a budget holder, that the company should invest and will get some sort of financial return through a localization project or program? In this particular case, this model is trying to address that question. And one of the things that I tend to find very often at discussions that I have at enterprise localization program level is that the budget holder and the localization manager, they don't speak the same language, they have different objectives. But as we know, our industry is all about building bridges. We build bridges between markets, between people. We help the world to connect. So why not apply the same principle and try and speak the budget holder's language? And that's where I started looking at, from an array of possibilities to choose from investment valuation methodologies or analysis frameworks. I looked at the net present value. It's a tool that I know quite well. It's buried in my financial past, and it's been present in the financial markets for many years. It's almost, as you can see, it's 71 or 70 years old. It's extremely quantifiable, so it actually turns into a number, which means that we can compare apples with apples. So, and many of the solutions and programs that we discuss with some of our customers, and this is, in particular, the NPV or the net present value applied to machine translation, they involve deploying machine translation into localization workflows. And so a lot of the times the question is, how do I sell this internally? How do I secure internally the budget? So this particular model aims to present a solution and a response in order to strengthen the investment business case for machine translation. Okay, so typically you have three key components from whenever you're looking at the net present value. So the net present value is used to analyze the profitability of an investment or project. It's just an investment analysis framework that compares net cash flows generated in different moments in time. That's as simple as that. It has three main components. The initial investment that I've denoted as I0, the cash flow or net cash flow that I've denoted by CF, and the 1 plus RR, which is typically called as the discount factor. So what is the initial investment, for example, in MT? So I normally call it the number to beat. So this is basically including all costs, all setup costs that you need to incur in order to deploy machine translation into a particular localization program. This includes investment costs to kick off the MT program. The cash flow, I think it's quite an intuitive concept, because when you invest in a particular product or service, when you have a project, an investment project, for example, you expect returns and savings. And eventually, if you keep that project going for a number of periods in time, you will see also that you will have running costs. So the cash flow, when it comes to machine translation, is no more, no less than the savings and revenues, and we will see an example in a few slides, of what the machine translation program generates, minus, of course, the running costs. We will see also what that means. The 1 plus RR is basically the factor or the component of the model that you will be comparing, that you'll be comparing your profitability against. So basically, what this rate means is the return rate of the best available investments alternative at the moment when you have to make the decision about to invest or not in machine translation or in deploying a machine translation program. So forget about the formula, don't worry about it. But it's kind of a straightforward, intuitive formula. Basically, it's your returns, your net returns and savings from machine translation technology minus your initial investment, which is pretty much the number to beat. Very straightforward decision criteria. If the net present value is above zero, so if it's positive, you invest. If it's negative, then you don't invest. Okay, so one incredibly important component or let's say factor in this particular model is time. We tend to measure in our industry, the vast majority of times, we tend to measure return on investment without taking into consideration time. So this means that you might be comparing different flows of cash in the exact same way, assuming that $1 today and $1 tomorrow are the same. So we know that $1 today is different from $1 tomorrow because there's inflation, there are interest rates, and by introducing the discounted cash, the discount factor, the 1 plus RR, what we are doing is enabling cash flows from different time or periods in time to be compared. So basically what you do is you make them equivalent and comparable by pooling cash flows that occur in moment 1, moment 2, or moment 3 to moment 0. So this basically allows you to compare apples with apples. So the cash flows are aligned in time. So imagine, as we were discussing, this is your I0, so you're today. This is the time where you need to decide if you're going to be deploying machine translation or not into your localization program. And you have calculated the I0, which means this is the cost of setting up your machine translation program. Then in year, let's say 2022, that machine translation program will generate cash flows. And these cash flows come, and we'll see it a bit more in detail in the next slide. These cash flows come from the savings and returns rate. For example, if you have a discounted rate with your LSP, if you have your products faster in terms of the marketplace, that also means that you're going to be selling more, and that, for example, you can gain a week of sales or a month of sales. Okay, and of course this happens across 3 periods of time, and I will later explain why 3 periods of time. And basically what we're doing with this discounted cash flow methodology is we're going to pool cash flow from year 1, cash flow from year 2, and cash flow from year 3 to moment 0. Each of these cash flows, when discounted by the 1 plus RR, that discount factor, they translate into a number. So the sum of these 3 cash flows minus the cost of setting up the machine translation program should be more than 0. So that is your decision-making criteria. Okay, how does this work in reality? So this is a bit more of detail in what I mentioned in terms of the initial investment or deployment investment, the annual net cash flow, and the 1 plus RR. And you know, one thing that I think is quite important to mention as well is that unlike some other localization activities and programs and projects for which ROI is tendentially tougher to estimate or to measure, an MT program has a very, I would say, measurable quantitative financial impact. So we can actually estimate and measure, or let's put it, I would say estimate the amounts involved before program deployment and as part of the initial assessment, part of the decision-making process about deploying or not. This means that we can estimate the return on investment of the machine translation program before we actually deploy it, and share it, of course, with the budget decision makers. But let's take a very quick look about the typical components of each of the model components when we're talking about machine translation. So typically you have the annual license for year 1 that you have to pay upfront. You have the hosting costs of the machine translation software. If there is any additional software deployment costs to launch, for example, or to integrate the MT solution with your TMS, that also needs to be taken into account. You know, the cleaning language assets and optimizing them, TMs, glossaries, monolingual reference material, and make them available, of course, for available and suitable for engine creation. You know, then it includes actually building, setting up the engines for production. If there's a sort of existing purpose or existing components to the machine translation model, that needs to be also taken into account. Testing, etc., etc. So these are the typical. There are probably a few more. The typical components of the initial deployment costs for launching a machine translation program into production. Then, of course, you have, that's when, you know, the profitability kicks in. In year 1, you're going to see the post-editing machine translation savings coming out of the rate or the rate rebate that you've discounted. You're going to be seeing, for example, the effect of having your products or services faster in the marketplace. So this will generate 1 week, 1 month, 2 weeks of sales, depending on how productive the machine translation engine is. And also, you know, there is a possibility of looking at an enterprise machine translation service as a managed solution. Okay, instead of the client, let's say, or the customer managing it internally, it also it becomes, or it can become, more cost effective at an enterprise level if you let the vendor manage this. But then you also have the annual running costs, and that includes you know, building new engines for new languages, you know, periodical retraining of the existing ones, and you know, any special features. I've seen, you know, a lot of them. For example, glossary enforcement, particular product line, particular brands. That's something that's quite normal to be requested. And of course, you have the annual licenses and the engine hosting for year 2 and 3. And then we reach the return rate of the best available option. So this means that this is the return rate or cost or opportunity costs of the best available option that you have when you decide to make the machine translation investment. So basically, what would you do alternatively with the funds that you have and that you're going to be allocating to MT, and what would be the return on that? You know, so for example, this can be, these are a few examples. Huh? I'm sure that there are much more or many more, because, you know, there's always a way to find an application for money. But, you know, some examples are there, you know, the cost of for example, an authoring tool that would improve TM matching, you know, the return of further cleaning and optimizing the language assets in order to achieve better matching. So there are plenty of, and depending on the models, of course, you know, you could decide to hire more internal translators to cope with the actual volumes. So this is an important aspect of the return on investment measurement model, which is the maturity. In my experience, I've seen the maturity of enterprise machine translation programs being reached, or the machine translation programs peak around year 3. The reason for it is because by then you would have launched and created and deployed the engines for the tier 1, tier 2 languages. And you would be able also, after year 1 and year 2, to assess and evaluate the return on investment based on this particular model. So this is, again, this model is an estimation done a priori, but then you validate and correct whatever deviations you're finding in your enterprise machine translation program as you go along and as you go through the years. You know, again, this is debatable, but the data that I've observed gives us some hints in that particular direction. I wanted to present you, we're reaching the final stage of the presentation. I want you to just share with you a very practical example, a client case. Of course, you know, I've hidden the name, but it's a very large European manufacturer, mainly looking at deploying machine translation into their top 10 languages. It's a very mature client. If you take a look at the context over there, there are a number of calculations, but the client was looking at deploying machine translation across 10 of their 20 languages, so their top 10 languages, which was handy because that meant that they had more data to train the engines. They were evaluating at the time buying or investing in an authoring tool and clean up their TMs massively. And the client wanted to know what would be the MT program's expected return on investment in order to promote the use of machine translation internally. So typically, as we looked in a previous slide, the initial investment was there. You know, we had to calculate the software license costs, the preparation and cleaning and optimization of the client's language assets, you know, from TMs to glossaries. We then built a number of customized candidate engines that we tested and evaluated their performance. We then found or delivered actually a findings report, and there were, you know, a number of configurations that were required at pre-deployment stage. So we reached across these 10 languages that the initial investment would be $93,000. Now, the benefits of this particular investment, so the cash inflow per se, was that through applying post-editing machine translation, you would expect a 25% decrease on the per word, on the new word rate across all 10 languages. And that alone would generate a $92,800 savings. Also, the project management fee would decrease from 5 to 3%. And the reason for it is because everybody would become more efficient. So the actual annual MT running benefits would amount to $102,340 each year. So again, this is a model because I'm assuming, well, I'm assuming, I know that the annual MT running benefits will be potentially higher in year 2 and year 3. But then you would still have the costs, the annual MT running costs that would amount to $44,000. So the benefits of the alternative investment to the MT program, we calculated them, and as you can see, were 8% in total, and they were weighted average of the benefits or the positive impact that a new authoring tool, the major review, cleaning of TMs and glossaries would produce. So basically, the 22% better matching in terms of translation memory would be was estimated to produce 8% of project savings per language. So this is the formula, and of course, you know, I would definitely. I wasn't interested in showing something that failed, so I showed these numbers here. But in reality, this was a real case. So the net present value generated across these 3 years for the global machine translation program was estimated initially in around $57,000. So the decision was to move ahead with the machine translation program. You know, we can discuss the numbers, and I will, if you want to take a closer look and a deeper dive into the numbers and the formula, I can definitely answer some questions with a bit more detail with the assumptions and what was done. But the idea behind it was that, you know, it was an extremely profitable deployment at the enterprise level. And that's it. I'm all done. I try to keep it as short as possible, and I hope that you have loads of questions, and I hope that you've enjoyed it.
Thank you, Rodrigo. Actually, we do. Steve has already told me that he has a question for you. So, Steve, would you like to ask it?
Sure, I will go ahead and ask the question live. Rodrigo, I think it was a very interesting presentation, and it's interesting that you applied these financial modeling concepts to ROI for machine translation. So my question is, I've frequently seen, you know, we're in the business of M&A, right? And we've frequently seen concepts such as discounted cash flow and net present value being used in valuation of a company, for example. So I was just wondering if you have any thoughts on, for example, valuing the value, estimating the value of a machine translation engine. If you have any thoughts on that, whether these concepts can be applied in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can estimate each of this. You can do exactly what I did per language. So you can estimate in reality the value or the return on investment for a particular language using that model. imagine that, and many times we know that enterprise machine translation models or programs, sorry, they start with a few languages, a very limited amount of languages, either because, the localization manager is slightly concerned, he or she never saw that working before, or because they don't have enough data, or because there's just generic skepticism about how the MT will perform. So if you apply this particular model to one machine translation engine, one language combination, this will turn also the return on investment for that particular language combination. So answering your question, yes, it is possible to apply this model to just one language combination, to one customized machine translation engine.
That's great. Thank you. There may be a couple other questions, so I'll let Anna go ahead and ask those.
Sure, I will. There are. So the first question is, why did you choose 3 years for the MT model maturity?
Well, I think I went through that in the presentation. I believe that there's a maturity, an observable maturity happening after year 2. Typically, year 1 is you can typically work with 1, 2, 3 language combinations, and then from that point onwards, you assess how well it has worked. You also think about the do's and don'ts, what has worked well, what has not worked well, and then you extrapolate good practices for the next 3, 4, 5, 6 languages. After year 2, typically, you have covered tier 1 languages that should be launched in year 1 and year 2, and you can evaluate the positive impact of deploying machine translation into your localization workflow. And then, year 3 is a consolidation year where you're going to be probably deploying machine translation across the more residual language combinations. So tier 3, if you prefer.
Yeah. So thanks a lot. And what about non-enterprise models who have fewer languages and fewer engines? Is it also applicable?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think the previous presentation touched that point. It's, MT is all about data, availability of data, quality of data. So can this model be transported into a smaller scale MT program? Yes, but what you will see is that the numbers will be proportionally smaller as well from a return on investment perspective, because there will be less volume, less spend, less data to train the engine. So the engine will be probably smaller as well. So everything shrinks per se.